Video games can be very difficult. However, when that difficulty isn't genuine, when it's fake, it just kind of sucks. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 10 dumb game difficulty mechanics we hate. Starting off at number 10, when higher difficulty just means bigger numbers. And when it comes to difficulty levels, this just comes up way too often. Like, instead of making the game harder by making the enemies smarter or more numerous, or changing up the level layouts, or anything that could be interesting and introduce new variables to the game, they just make it so the enemies take more hits and you take less hits. As an easy example, this can be found in pretty much every single Call of Duty campaign. There is absolutely nothing different about them. It's just that you die faster than if you played it on an easier setting. Of course, that alone can make the game more interesting and engaging. It is a balance issue, and it may be that the hard mode is a more balanced game. I can't tell you. But when the developers barely put any time into testing these difficulty levels, it's super annoying. Like, say, Borderlands 2's Ultimate Vault Hunter mode, which gives enemies about 4 times as much health as the previous difficulty, and on top of that, it regenerates. Like, enemies are bullet spongy enough in Borderlands games, but this is, it's beyond ridiculous. Honestly, this sort of fake difficulty pops up so often, it's almost pointless to try to come up with examples. It's rare that a game actually does something interesting with its difficulty options. Most of the time, you get this. It just depends on whether these kinds of difficulty options are actually fun or if they just turn the game into a total slog. Like, maybe normal, you just take too much damage. Therefore, hard works better. That's not enough though, right? And number 9 is frustrating time limits. You know, when the game puts you on the clock and barely gives you enough time to succeed. Like, okay, so this one is just basically all about Dead Rising. In the first Dead Rising games, you're just constantly on the clock. If you didn't get to a certain location before time expired, the story would just fail. You'd have to restart the whole game. They gave you a little more leeway in Dead Rising 2, and especially 3, but you were still on the clock at all times, and if you were late, it would be game over. And it's not like it's all you had to do. The original Dead Rising was constantly bombarding you with tasks like rescuing people or dealing with psychos. So you always had to keep in mind how much time you had to do anything, which on one level did make the game more interesting, sure, but it also made it really frustrating at times. Another game that used time limits was Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. This one, like Dead Rising, is sort of a love it or hate it game, and a lot of people love how unique Majora's Mask is, while others find the time limit just too strict. Remember, in Majora's Mask, you've got 3 in-game days to do your thing before this freaky moon comes and crashes into the world. But you can reset back to the first day at any point, so it's not too frustrating. But when you get into dungeons and this whole mechanic gets, really nerve-wracking, because you have to get to the dungeon and beat the boss as quickly as possible. Otherwise, you will have to redo the whole thing. And I mean everything. You have to resolve all the puzzles, recollect the keys, everything. Number 8 is too long checkpoints, a classic annoyance that is becoming more rare in recent games, but it has not completely gone away. Having these huge chunks of the game you have to replay because there's a lack of checkpoints. Probably one of the most infamous examples is Ninja Gaiden from the NES. If you die at any point during the last act, which covers 6-1 through 6-5, including the final boss's 3 forms, you have to go all the way back. And not to the start of level 6-5, you gotta go way back to 6-1. It is brutal, and a big reason why this game is considered as hard as it is. A big part of the challenge of Dark Souls, for instance, is sometimes there are not enough checkpoints. Probably the worst game in regards to this is Demon's Souls. You only ever get a checkpoint at the start of a level, and then another one after you beat a boss, and that is it. So you pretty much have to completely redo a section if you die at a boss. And probably the worst boss run in the entire Soulsborne series can be found in the Shrine of Storms leading to the Old Hero boss fight. It's just a brutal gauntlet that basically forces you to fight a lot of the enemies rather than just run past them. Honestly, it's a lot harder than the actual boss at the end of it. Another series that suffers from this is the GTA series. It took until GTA 5 to fully incorporate mid-mission checkpoints. Until then, if you died during a mission in any of the previous ones, you had to start the whole thing over again. Even in like super long multi-part missions. This is the main reason the older GTA games are hard to go back to, because Rockstar finally went all in on checkpoints in GTA 5. Just a godsend. And number 7 is trial and error gameplay. Anytime a game simply expects you to constantly replay a section to get it exactly right, otherwise you just die. Like, with certain horror games, it is just rife with sequences like this. where you have to run away from a monster and follow a precise sequence of actions. And if you don't do them right, you die and you have to restart. That kind of thing. Like it can work. This is basically how games like Inside play, but some games are really terrible about signposting what you need to do. And it's so frustrating because of it. Probably one of the worst games of this sort of thing, Outlast 2. It's your standard guy gets hunted with the creepy cult type story, but once in a while you're expected to pull off an insane escape sequence. Like, the problem with the game's visuals here is that they're so dark and muddy a lot of the time, you really can't tell what the game wants you to do, and that's fully the problem with these sequences in this game. Another truly terrible sequence of this nature can be found in the Alone in the Dark game from 2008. There's a car escape sequence where you have to get away from this collapsing city, and the game, it just expects absolute perfect driving from you, even though this is the first time you've ever driven a car in the game. There are so many games that pull a stunt like this, but it feels like recently it's been horror games that have been most guilty of it. It would be nice if that were a trend that stopped. Number 6 is buggy and glitchy game mechanics. Like, this is an obvious one. Bugs are glitches that make a game exponentially harder. Like, a buggy game that would normally be something that's a cakewalk, but it turns into a hair-pulling exercise in frustration. Like, try playing a game with unresponsive controls or ones that'll just crash randomly. It's the worst. Like, okay, perfect example for you is Sonic 2006. This is just, to call it infamously buggy is an understatement. It is infinitely buggy. It has it all. It's got the awkward controls, especially during the Mach speed sections, that they just make you fly off course, and it just takes a slight tap with the controller to fly off to your untimely death. There's all these annoying platforming sections where you can fall through the world by mistake. It's got automatic sections. They're really awkward to control. You'll go in the wrong direction. Sometimes it's not even you that makes it go in the wrong direction. It's just zero input, and it's like, let's go the wrong way. It's all incredibly frustrating. And just to be clear, it's not something that only shows up in the worst of the worst, like Sonic 2006. We've actually seen a lot of buggy releases in the past year, and even some of the biggest AAA releases with the highest budgets out there, I am looking at you, Cyberpunk 2077, run into problems from bugs. However, the jankiness of Sonic 06 it's so high that even today it's just a perfect example. At number 5 is confusing difficulty names. Like, sometimes just selecting the difficulty level can be annoying, especially in games where they don't explicitly tell you what the normal mode even is. Probably the worst games for this is the GameCube original Beautiful Joe. There's 2 difficulty modes, kids and adults. Any sane person out there would think that adult mode is the normal mode and kid mode is the easy one, right? Wrong. Kids mode is actually the normal mode, while adult mode is hard. And now that you've selected it, there is no going back. If it starts getting too tough for you, and it will, you have to restart the game entirely. This can be really annoying in games that have 2 normal difficulty settings as well, like Call of Duty's regular and hardened difficulties. The actual difference between the two is super vague, but that'll possibly lead you into playing a game at a difficulty much harder than you expected. And thankfully, for those games at least, you can change the difficulty level at any time, but still. At number 4 is these impossible puzzles. Like, this one's pretty obvious, right? A good puzzle game will give you that eureka moment where the puzzle comes together. You feel super smart for solving it, right? A bad puzzle game, however, makes you throw up your hands and say, how was I supposed to figure that out? When you finally end up brute forcing the solution. Sometimes games just do not give you enough information, or they add rules that don't make any sense, or they just make everything too obscure or confusing, and it turns a game that should be difficult into something that players will absolutely hate. And when it comes to puzzle games, what's almost impossible for you might be totally obvious for someone else. There's no surefire thing that says objectively if a puzzle is too hard or not. It really does come down to the individual playing the game. Maybe one of the worst examples of this, though, can be found in The Witness. Normally, this game's puzzles are great, but that one puzzle in the jungle is just the worst. If you've played this game, you know exactly what I am talking about. With this set of puzzles, you have to input these chirping sounds into the puzzle, with another set of chirps interrupting that one that makes things even more annoying. Like, my blood pressure is raising just describing this. Like, sound-based puzzles categorically are bad enough on their own, but adding additional noise makes it harder to tell what's going on. And the actual solution is the sort of thing you would expect. You have to input the distraction chirps instead of the normal ones, but good luck telling them apart. Basically, any game can have these kinds of puzzles, not just puzzle games, but if you run into one, it's going to ruin your day. And number 3, when easy modes cut out content. Like, this is a really annoying one that still shows up a lot these days. Like when the game doesn't let you finish because you played it on easy. One of the nastiest examples can be seen in Contra 4, where it just stops before the final stage and makes fun of you for playing on easy. I'm not gonna pretend that I'm playing all these games on easy mode, but a lot of cognitively disabled people are, and doing that thing kinda sucks. Not to be a snowflake or anything, but come on, we want more people playing games and we want everyone to be able to play them, right? Another nasty example shows up in Time Splitters 2. Like if you play on easy, the levels are about half as long as they normally would be. And you'd think this sort of thing would have disappeared by now, but it's still showing up in games, like in Cuphead. If you select simple, it just makes it so you can't fight the last 2 bosses. And number 2 is confusing dynamic difficulty. Certain games try to make a game more fair by having a dynamic difficulty. That is to say, when a difficulty level will go up and down depending on how well you play the game. Like do better and the difficulty goes up, making the game more challenging, or do worse and the difficulty goes down. Just compensates, adjust the game to the player. Good stuff, right? At least on paper. However, it can sometimes lead to situations where the game can get way too hard or way too easy without really telling the player why. Case in point, the original Max Payne would get harder if you killed more enemies and took less damage. Like that would be good, but the problem is that death would come in seconds. And for most players, that meant they would be saving constantly. And because you die so fast, most players wouldn't wait for the death animation to end to give you the option to load. Instead, they would just quick load back to a previous save. So for most people, the game would think that they're doing really well because they never die. So the game would just get harder and harder and harder. Another infamous example of dynamic difficulty gone wrong is Final Fantasy VIII. The game scales enemies to match your party, so it basically makes grinding of any kind at all pointless because you never really get stronger than enemies just by leveling up. If you played this game without realizing that, and let's say you hit a tough boss, you could potentially waste hours of your time grinding to level up without realizing that it's a total waste of time. Of course, this also led players to discover ways to completely break the game by avoiding leveling up, but that's sort of unrelated to what we're talking about here. Bottom line, these dynamic difficulty levels can really suck sometimes. And finally, number 1, and let's just say that this one covers a lot of ground, but cheating AI. Basically, anytime the artificial intelligence gets to break the rules of the game, like it's something that's basically everywhere in gaming too. Like if you play any Civilization style game, you pretty much have to go in expecting the AI to cheat like crazy. Like they get free resources, they can build cities wherever they want, and you have to build yours at least 4 tiles apart. Hell, in Civilization Revolution, the AI can teleport their units through the fog of war, so they can just attack you from any direction. This sort of thing can be seen in other genres too, like in the original F-Zero, where if you're playing on Master Mode, the AI will just always be at max speed and have perfect handling. Even if you manage to get in front of them, they're just right behind you. And it doesn't matter how much you think you should be getting ahead, they will always be right behind you. Another genre that AI cheats like crazy is fighting games. Like they're not as bad these days, but like back in Street Fighter 2's era, the AI could do stuff like perform charge moves without having to actually, charge. Remember, charge moves work in Street Fighter by holding a certain direction for a second, but the AI can pull off these kinds of moves without stopping, and even while moving in the opposite direction. It's just completely unfair. The funny thing is that nowadays, yes, a lot of the games do have AI that does things that make them easier. Little things like having AI enemies in FPS games shoot you less or just flat out do less damage if you're not looking at them, and even intentionally move into your field of view so they're easy to shoot at. But for most games, there's always going to be some AI cheating going on. Sometimes, frankly, it's not bad, but sometimes it is really annoying. But at the moment, it's also pretty much unavoidable. That's all for today. What do you think about these? Do you experience these? Have you noticed them? Are you going to be able to unsee them? Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. The best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Do not forget to enable all notifications, and as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter @FalconTheHero, and we'll see you next time right here on gameranx.